Admirable indeed is the training acquired in these voyages round the world. In them, the crew, the officers, and sailors are constantly brought face to face with unforeseen difficulties and dangers, which call forth the best qualities of the sailor, the soldier, and the man. If France succumbed to the naval superiority of Great Britain during the Revolutionary and Imperial Wars, was it not fully as much owing to this stern training of the British seamen, as to the internal dissensions which deprived France of the services of the greater part of her naval staff? Be this as it may, the English Admiralty, shortly after Byron's return, organized a new expedition. Their preparations appear to have been far too hasty. The Dauphin only anchored in the Downs at the beginning of May, and 6 weeks later, on the 19th of June, Captain Samuel Wallis received the command. This officer, after attaining the highest rank in the military marine service, had been entrusted with an important command in Canada, and had assisted in the capture of Louisbourg. We cannot tell what qualities commended him to the Admiralty, in preference to his companions in arms, but in any case, the noble lords had no reason to regret their decision. Wallis hastened the needful preparations on board the Dauphin, and on the 21st of August, less than a month after receiving his commission, he joined the sloop Swallow and the Prince Frederick in Plymouth Harbor. The latter was in charge of Lieutenant Brine, the former was commanded by Philip Carteret. Both were most distinguished officers who had just returned from a voyage round the world with Commodore Byron, and whose reputation was destined to be increased by their second voyage. The Swallow, unfortunately, appears to have been quite unfit for the service demanded of her. Having already been 30 years in service, the sheathing was very much worn, and her keel was not studded with nails, which might have served instead of sheathing to protect her from parasites. Again, the provisions and marketable commodities were so unequally divided that the Swallow received much less than the Dauphin. Carteret begged in vain for a rope yarn, a forge, and various things which his experience told him would be indispensable. This rebuff confirmed Carteret in his notion that he should not get further than the Falkland Isles, but none the less he took every precaution which his experience dictated to him. As soon as the equipment was complete, on the 22nd of April, the vessels set sail. It did not take Wallis long to find out that the Swallow was a bad sailor, and that he might anticipate much trouble during his voyage. However, no accident happened during the voyage to Madeira, where the vessels put in to revictual. Upon leaving the port, the commander supplied Carteret with a copy of his instructions, and selected Port Famine, in the Strait of Magellan, as a rendezvous in case of separation. Their stay at Port Praya, in the island of Santiago, was shortened on account of the ravages committed there by the smallpox, and Wallis would not even allow his crew to land. Shortly after leaving the equator, the Prince Frederick gave signs of distress, and it was necessary to send the carpenter on board to stop up a leak on the larboard side. This vessel, which was provided with inferior provisions, counted already a number of sick among her crew. Towards 8 o'clock in the evening of the 19th of November, the crews perceived in the NE a meteor of extraordinary appearance, moving in a straight line towards the SW with marvelous rapidity. It was visible for almost a minute, and left behind a trail of light, so bright that the deck was illuminated as if it were midday. On the 8th of December, the coast of Patagonia was at last visible. Wallis skirted it until he reached Cape Virgin, where he landed with the armed detachments of the Swallow and Prince Frederick. A crowd of natives awaited them upon the shore, and received with apparent satisfaction the knives, scissors, and other trifles which it was usual to distribute upon such occasions, but they would not part with guanacos, ostriches, or any other game which were seen in their possession for any consideration. Wallis says, "We took the measure of the largest of them. One was 6 feet 6 inches in height. Several were 5 feet 5 inches, but the average was 5 foot 6 or 6 feet. It must be remembered that these were English feet, which are only 305 millimeters. If these natives were not quite so tall as the giants mentioned by previous navigators, they were very little less striking. Each one," continues the narrative, "carried a strange kind of weapon. It consisted of 2 round stones, covered with copper, each of which weighed about a pound, and they were attached at both ends to a cord about 8 feet long. They used them like slings, holding one of the stones in the hand, and whirling the other round the head until it attained sufficient velocity, when they threw it towards the object they wished to strike. They managed this weapon so adroitly that they could strike a butt no larger than a shilling with both stones, at a distance of 15 roods. They did not, however, employ it in chasing guanacos or ostriches. Wallis conducted 8 of these Patagonians on board. They did not appear surprised, as one would have expected, at the number of new and extraordinary things they met with. They advanced, retired, made 1,000 grimaces before the mirrors, shouted with laughter, and conversed animatedly among themselves. Their attention was attracted by the pigs for a moment, but they were immensely amused with the guinea fowls and turkeys. It was difficulty to persuade them to leave the vessel. At last they returned to the shore, singing and making signs of delight to their countrymen who awaited them on the bank. They made 1,000 grimaces. They made 1,000 grimaces. On the 17th of December, Wallis signaled the Swallow to head the squadron for the passage of the Straits of Magellan. At Port Famine, the commander had 2 tents erected on shore for the sick, the woodcutters, and the sailors. Fish in sufficient quantities for each day's meal, abundance of celery, and acid fruits similar to cranberries and barberries were to be found in this harbor, and in the course of about a fortnight, these remedies completely restored the numerous sufferers from scurvy. The vessels were repaired and partially calked. The sails were mended, the rigging, which had been a good deal strained, was overhauled and repaired, and all was soon ready for sea again. But Wallis first ordered a large quantity of wood to be cut and conveyed on board the Prince Frederick, for transport to the Falkland Isles, where it is not obtainable. At the same time, he had hundreds of young trees carefully dug up, and the roots covered in their native soil to facilitate their transplantation in Port Egmont, that in taking root, as there was reason to hope they would, they might supply the barren archipelago with this precious commodity. Lastly, the provisions were divided between the Dauphin and the Swallow, the former taking sufficient for a year, the latter for 10 months. We will not enlarge upon the different incidents which befell the 2 ships in the Straits of Magellan, such as sudden gales, tempests and snowstorms, irregular and rapid currents, heavy seas and fogs, which more than once brought the vessels within an inch of destruction. The Swallow especially was in such a dilapidated condition that Carteret besought Wallis to consider his vessel no longer of any use in the expedition, and to tell him what course should best be pursued for the public good. Wallis replied, "The orders of the Admiralty are concise, and you must conform to them, and accompany the Dauphin as long as possible. I am aware that the Swallow is a bad sailor. I will accommodate myself to her speed and follow her movements, for it is most important that in case of accident to one of the ships, the other should be within reach, to give all the assistance in her power." Carteret had nothing to urge in reply, but he augured badly for the result of the expedition. As the ships approached the opening of the straits on the Pacific side, the weather became abominable. A thick fog, falls of snow and rain, currents which sent the vessels onto the breakers, a chopping sea, contributed to detain the navigators in the straits until the 10th of April. On that day, the Dauphin and Swallow were separated off Cape Pillar and could not find each other, Wallis not having fixed a rendezvous in case of separation. Before we follow Wallis on his voyage across the Pacific, we will give a short account of the wretched natives of Tierra del Fuego and of the general appearance of their country. These wretches, who were as miserable and debased as possible, subsisted upon the raw flesh of seals and penguins. One of our men, says Wallis, who fished with a line, bestowed a live fish, which he had just caught, and which was about the size of a herring, upon one of these Americans. He took it with the eagerness of a dog snatching a bone. He commenced operations by killing the fish with a bite near the gills, and proceeded to devour it, beginning at the head and finishing at the tail, without rejecting the bones, fins, scales, or entrails. In fact, these people swallowed everything that was offered to them, cooked or uncooked, fresh or salt, but they refused all drink but water. Their sole covering was a miserable seal skin reaching to the knees. Their weapons were javelins tipped with a fish bone. They all suffered from bad eyes, which the English attributed to their custom of living in smoke to protect themselves from mosquitoes. Lastly, they emitted a most offensive smell, only to be likened to that of foxes, which doubtless arose from their excessively filthy habits. Although certainly not inviting, this picture is graphic, as all navigators testify. It would appear that progress is not possible to these savages, so nearly allied to brutes. Civilization is a dead letter to them, and they still vegetate like their forefathers, with no wish to improve, and with no ambition to attain a more comfortable existence. Wallis continues. Thus we quitted this savage and uninhabitable region, where for 4 months we had been in constant danger of shipwreck, where in the height of summer the weather is foggy, cold, and stormy, where almost all the valleys are without verdure, and the mountains without woods, In short, where the land which one can see rather resembles the ruins of a world than the abode of living creatures. Wallis was scarcely free of the strait when he set sail westward in spite of dense fogs and with high wind and such a heavy sea that for weeks together there was not a dry corner in the ship. The constant exposure to damp engendered cold and severe fevers, to which scurvy shortly succeeded. Upon reaching 32 degrees south latitude and degrees west longitude, the navigator steered due north. Upon the 6th of June, two islands were discovered amidst general rejoicings. The ship's boats, well armed and equipped, reached the shore under command of Lieutenant Furneaux. A quantity of coconuts and antiscorbutic plants were obtained, but although the English found huts and sheds, they did not meet with a single inhabitant. This island was discovered on the eve of Whitsunday and hence received the name Whitsunday. It is situated in 19 degrees 26 south latitude and degrees 56 west longitude. Like the following islands, it belongs to the Paumotu group. Next day, the English endeavored to make overtures to the inhabitants of another island, but the natives appeared so ill-disposed and the coast was so steep that it was impossible to land. After tacking about all night, Wallis dispatched the boats, with orders not to use violence to the inhabitants if they could avoid it, or unless absolutely obliged. As Lieutenant Furneaux approached the land, he was astonished by the sight of two large pirogues with double masts, in which the natives were on the eve of embarking. As soon as they had done so, the English landed and searched the island thoroughly. They discovered several pits full of good water. The soil was firm, sandy, covered with trees, more especially coconut trees, palm trees, and sprinkled with antiscorbutic plants. The narrative says, "The natives of this island were of moderate stature. Their skin was brown, and they had long black hair, straggling over the shoulders. The men were finely formed, and the women were beautiful. Some coarse material formed their garment, which was tied round the waist, and appeared to be intended to be raised round the shoulders." In the afternoon, Wallis sent the lieutenant to procure water and to take possession of the island in the name of King George Roman III. It was called Queen Charlotte's Island, in honor of the English queen. After reconnoitering personally, Wallis determined to remain in this region for a week, in order to profit by the facilities it afforded for provisioning. In their walks, the English met with working implements made of shells and sharpened stones shaped like axes, scissors, and awls. They also noticed boats in course of construction, made of boards joined together. But they were most of all astonished at meeting with tombs upon which the dead bodies were exposed under a sort of awning, and where they putrefied in the open air. When they quitted the island, they left hatchets, nails, bottles, and other things as reparation for any damage they might have committed. The 17th century teemed with philanthropic aspirations, and from the accounts of all navigators, one is led to believe that the theory so much advocated was put into practice upon most occasions. Humanity had made great strides. Difference of color no longer presented an insuperable barrier to a man's being treated as a brother, and the convention which at the close of the century ordered the freedom of the black set a seal to the convictions of numbers. The Dauphin discovered new land the same day that she left Queen Charlotte's Island. It lay to the westward, but after cruising along the coast, the vessel was unable to find anchorage. Lying low, it was covered with trees, neither coconuts nor inhabitants were to be found, and it evidently was merely a rendezvous for the hunters and fishers of the neighboring islands. Wallis therefore decided not to stop. It received the name of Egmont, in honor of Earl Egmont, then Chief Lord of the Admiralty. The following days brought new discoveries. Gloucester, Cumberland, William, Henry, and Osnaburg Islands were sighted in succession. Lieutenant Furneaux was able to procure provisions without landing at the last named. Observing several large pirogues on the beach, he drew the conclusion that other and perhaps larger islands would be found at no great distance, where they would probably find abundant provisions, and to which access might be less difficult. His prevision was right. As the sun rose upon the 19th, the English sailors were astonished at finding themselves surrounded by pirogues of all sizes, having on board no less than 800 natives. After having consulted together at some distance, a few of the natives approached, holding in their hands banana branches. They were on the point of climbing up the vessels, when an absurd accident interrupted these cordial relations. The natives waving palm leaves as a sign of welcome. The natives waving palm leaves as a sign of welcome. One of them had climbed into the gangway when a goat ran at him. Turning, he perceived the strange animal upon its hind legs preparing to attack him again. Overcome with terror, he jumped back into the sea, an example quickly followed by the others. It recalled the incident of the sheep of Panurge. Recovering from this alarm, they again climbed into the ship and brought all their cunning to bear upon petty thefts. However, only one officer had his hat stolen. The vessel all the time was following the coast in search of a fitting harbor, whilst the boats coasted the shore for soundings. The English had never found a more picturesque and attractive country in any of their voyages. On the shore, the huts of the natives were sheltered by shady woods, in which flourished graceful clusters of coconut trees. Graduated chains of hills, with wooded summits, and the silver sheen of rivers glistening amid the verdure as they found their way to the sea, added to the beauty of the interior. The boats sent to take soundings were suddenly surrounded at the entrance of a large bay by a crowd of pirogues. Wallis, to avoid a collision, gave the order for the discharge from the swivel gun above the natives' heads, but although the noise terrified them, they still continued their approach. The captain accordingly ordered his boats to make for the shore, and the natives, finding themselves disregarded, threw some sharp stones which wounded a few sailors. But the captains of the boats replied to this attack by a volley of bullets, which injured one of them, and was followed by the flight of the rest. The Dauphin anchored next day at the mouth of a large river in 20 fathoms of water. The sailors rejoiced universally. The natives immediately surrounded them with pirogues, bringing pigs, fowls, and various fruits, which were quickly exchanged for hardware and nails. One of the boats employed in taking soundings, however, was attacked by blows from paddles and sticks, and the sailors were forced to use their weapons. One native was killed, a second severely wounded, and the rest jumped into the water. Seeing that they were not pursued, and conscious that they themselves had been the aggressors, they returned to traffic with the Dauphin as if nothing had happened. Upon returning on board, the officers reported that the natives had invited them to land, more especially the women, with unequivocal gestures, and that, moreover, there was excellent anchorage near the shore within reach of water. The only inconvenience arose from a considerable swell. The Dauphin accordingly weighed anchor and proceeded into the open sea to run with the wind, when all at once Wallis perceived a bay 7 or 8 miles distant, which he determined to reach. The captain was soon to experience the truth of the proverb, which asserts that one had better leave well alone. Although soundings were taken by the boats as they advanced, the Dauphin struck on a rock and damaged her forepart. The usual measures in such a case were taken immediately, but outside the chain of madreporic rocks, no depth could be sounded. It was consequently impossible to cast anchor or to use the capstan. What course had best be pursued in this critical situation? The vessel beat violently against the rocks, and a host of pirogues waited in expectation of a shipwreck, eager to clutch their prey. Fortunately, at the end of an hour, a favorable breeze rising disengaged the Dauphin and wafted her into good anchorage. The damage done was not serious, and was as easily repaired as forgotten. Wallis, rendered prudent by the constant efforts of the natives, divided his men into 4 parties, one of which was always to be armed, and he ordered guns to be fired. But after 1 or 2 rounds, the number of pirogues increased, and no longer laden with poultry, they appeared to be filled with stones. The crews of the larger vessels also were augmented. All at once, upon a given signal, a storm of pebbles fell upon the ship. Wallis ordered a general discharge, and had 2 guns loaded with fine shot. The natives, after some slight hesitation and disorder, returned to the attack with great bravery, and the captain, noticing the constantly increasing numbers of the assailants, was not without anxiety as to the result, when an unexpected event put an end to the contest. Among the pirogues which attacked the Dauphin most energetically was one which appeared to contain a chief, as from it the signal of attack was given. A well-directed shot cut this double pirogue in 2. This was enough to decide the natives upon retreat. They set about it so precipitately that in less than half an hour not a single boat remained in sight. The vessel was then towed into port, and so placed as to protect the disembarkation. Lieutenant Furneaux landed at the head of a strong detachment of sailors and marines, and planting the English flag, took possession of the island in the name of the King of England, in whose honor it was named George III. The natives called it Tahiti. After prostrating themselves and offering various marks of repentance, the natives appeared anxious to commence friendly and honest business with the English, but fortunately Wallis, who was detained on board by severe illness, perceived preparations for a simultaneous attack by land and sea upon the men sent to find water. The shorter the struggle, the less the loss. Acting upon which principle, directly the natives came within gunshot range, a few discharges dispersed their fleet. To put a stop to these attempts, it was necessary to make an example. Wallis decided with regret that it was so. He accordingly sent a detachment on shore at once with his carpenters, ordering them to destroy every pirogue which was hauled up on the beach. More than 50, many of them 60 feet long, were hacked to pieces. Upon this, the Tahitians decided to give in. They brought pigs, dogs, stuffs, and fruits to the shore, placed them there, and then withdrew. The English left in exchange hatchets and toys which were carried off to the forest with many delighted gestures. Peace was established, and from the morrow, a regular and abundant traffic commenced, which supplied the ships with the fresh provisions needed by the crews. There was ground for hope that these amicable relations would continue during their stay in the island, now that the natives had once realized the power and effect of the strangers' weapons. Wallis, therefore, ordered a tent to be prepared near the water supply, and disembarked all the sufferers from scurvy, whilst the healthy members of his company were engaged in repairing the rigging, mending the sails, and calking and repainting the vessel, putting her, in short, in a condition fitted for the long journey which was to take her to England. Polynesia. Grave par e moriu. At this juncture, Wallis's illness assumed an alarming character. The first lieutenant was in hardly better health. All the responsibility of the expedition fell upon Furneaux, who was quite equal to the task. After a rest of 15 days, during which the peace had not been disturbed, Wallis found all his invalids restored to health. Provisions, however, became less plentiful. The natives, spoilt by the abundance of nails and hatchets, became more exacting. Upon the 15th of July, a tall woman, apparently some 45 years of age, of majestic appearance, and who seemed to be much respected by the natives, came on board the Dauphin. Wallis at once perceived by the dignity of her deportment and the freedom of her manner, peculiar to persons habituated to command, that she was of high station. He presented her with a blue mantle, a looking-glass, and other gewgaws, which she received with an expression of profound contentment. Upon leaving the vessel, she invited the captain to land and to pay her a visit. Wallis, although still very weak, did not fail to comply with this request next day. He was conducted to a large hut, which covered about 327 feet in length and in width. The roof was constructed of palm leaves and was supported by 53 pillars. A considerable crowd, collected together by the event, lined the approach and received him respectfully. The visit was enlivened by a comical incident. The surgeon of the vessel, who perspired greatly from the effects of the walk, to relieve himself took off his wig. A sudden exclamation from one of the Indians at this sight drew general attention to the prodigy, and all fixed their eyes upon it. The whole assemblage remained perfectly still for some moments, in the silence of astonishment, which could not have been greater if they had seen one of our company decapitated. Next day, a messenger, sent to convey a present to Queen Obroa, in acknowledgment of her gracious reception, found her giving a feast to several hundred persons. Her servants carried the dishes to her already prepared, the meat in cocoanut shells, and the shellfish in a sort of wooden trough, similar to those used by our butchers. She herself distributed them with her own hands to each of her guests, who were sitting and standing all round the house. When this was over, she seated herself upon a sort of raised dais, and 2 women beside her gave her food. They offered the viands to her in their fingers, and she had only to take the trouble to open her mouth. The consequences of this exchange of civilities were speedily felt. The market was once more fully supplied with provisions, although no longer at the same low price as upon the first arrival of the English. Lieutenant Furneaux reconnoitered the length of the coast westward, to gain an idea of the island, and to see what it was possible to obtain from it. The English were everywhere well received. They found a pleasant country, densely populated, whose inhabitants appeared in no hurry to sell their commodities. All their working implements were either of stone or of bone, which led Lieutenant Furneaux to infer that the Tahitians possessed no metals. As they had no earthenware vessels, they had no idea that water could be heated. They discovered it one day when the Queen dined on board. One of the principal members of her suite, having seen the surgeon pour water from the boiler into the teapot, turned the tap and received the scalding liquor upon his hand. Finding himself burnt, he uttered most frightful screams and ran round the cabin making most extravagant gestures. His companions, unable to imagine what had happened to him, stared at him with mingled astonishment and fear. The surgeon hastened to interfere, but for a long time the poor Tahitian refused to be comforted. Some days later, Wallis discovered that his sailors stole nails to give them to the native women. They even went so far as to raise the planks of the ship to obtain screws, nails, bolts, and all the bits of iron which united them to the timbers. Wallis treated the offense rigorously, but nothing availed, and in spite of the precaution he took, of allowing no one to leave the vessel without being searched, these robberies constantly occurred. An expedition, undertaken into the interior, discovered a large valley watered by a beautiful river. Everywhere the soil was carefully cultivated, and arrangements had been made for watering the gardens and the fruit plantations. Farther penetrations into the interior proved the capacious windings of the river. The valley narrowed, the hills were succeeded by mountains. At every step, the way became more difficult. A peak, distant about 6 miles from the place of landing, was climbed, in the hope of thus discovering the entire island, even to its smallest recesses. But the view was intercepted by yet higher mountains. On the side towards the sea, however, nothing interfered with the magnificent view which stretched before their gaze, everywhere hills covered with magnificent woods, upon whose verdant slopes the huts of the natives stood out clearly, and in the valleys with their numberless cabins and gardens surrounded by hedges, the scenes were still more enchanting. The sugar cane, ginger plant, tamarind, and tree ferns with coconut trees furnished the principal resources of this fertile country. Wallis, wishing to enrich it still more with the productions of our own climate, caused peach, cherry, and plum stones to be planted, as well as lemon, orange, and lime pips, and sowed quantities of vegetable seeds. At the same time, he gave the queen a present of a cat about to kitten, of 2 cocks, fowls, geese, and other domestic animals, which he hoped might breed well. However, time pressed, and Wallis decided to leave. When he announced his intention to the queen, she threw herself upon a seat and cried for a long time, with so much grief that it was impossible to comfort her. She remained upon the vessel up to the last moment, and as it set sail, embraced us, says Wallis, in the tenderest way, weeping plenteously, and our friends the Tahitians bade us farewell with so much sorrow, and in so touching a manner that I felt heavy-hearted and my eyes filled with tears. The uncourteous reception of the English, and the repeated attempts made by the natives to seize the vessel, would hardly have led to the idea of a painful separation. However, as the proverb has it, all's well that ends well. Of Wally's observations of the manners and customs of the island, we shall only enumerate the few following, as we shall have occasion to return to them again in relating the voyages undertaken by Bougainville and Cook. Tall, well-built, active, slightly dark in complexion, the natives were clothed in a species of white stuff made from the bark of trees. 2 pieces of stuff completed their costume. One was square and looked like a blanket. The head was thrust through a hole in the center, and it recalled the zarapo of the Mexicans and the poncho of the South American Indian. The second piece was rolled round the body without being tightened. Almost all men and women tattoo their bodies with black lines close together, representing different figures. The operation was thus performed. The pattern was pricked in the skin, and the holes filled with a sort of paste composed of oil and grease, which left an indelible mark. Headdresses of natives of Tahiti. Headdresses of natives of Tahiti. Facsimile of early engraving. Civilization has little advanced. We have already stated that the Tahitians did not understand earthenware vessels. Wallis, therefore, presented the queen with a saucepan, which everybody flocked to inspect with extreme curiosity. As to religion, the captain found no trace of that. He only noticed that upon entering certain places, which he took to be cemeteries, they maintained a respectful appearance and wore mourning apparel. One of the natives, more disposed than his companions to adopt English manners, was presented with a complete suit of clothes, which became him very well. Jonathan, so they had named him, was quite proud of his new outfit. To put the finishing touch to his manners, he desired to learn the use of a fork, but habit was too strong for him. His hands always went to his mouth, and the bit of meat at the end of the fork found its way to his ear. It was the 27th of July when Wallis left the George Roman III island. After coasting Duke of York Island, he discovered several islands or islets in succession, upon which he did not touch. For example, Charles Saunders, Lord Howe, Scilly, Boscon, and Keppel Islands, where the hostile character of the natives and the difficulty of disembarkation prevented his landing. Winter was now to begin in the southern region. The vessel leaked in all directions, the stern especially was much strained by the rudder. Was it wise, under such circumstances, to sail for Cape Horn or the Straits of Magellan? Would it not be running the risk of certain shipwreck? Would it not be better to reach Tinian or Batavia, where repairs were possible, and to return to Europe by the Cape of Good Hope? Wallis decided upon the latter course. He steered for the northwest, and upon the 19th of September, after a voyage which was too fortunate to supply any incidents, he cast anchor in the Tinian harbor. The incidents which marked Byron's stay in this place were repeated, with far too much regularity. Wallis could not rejoice over its facilities for provisioning or the temperature of the country any more than his predecessors. But the sufferers from scurvy recovered in a short time, the sails were mended, and the vessel calked and repaired, and the crew had the unexpected good fortune of catching no fever. On the 16th October, 1769, the Dauphin returned to sea, but this time she encountered a succession of frightful storms, which tore the sails, reopened the leakage, broke the rudder, and carried away the poop with all that was to be found on the forecastle. However, the Bashies were rounded, and Formosa Strait crossed. Sandy Isle, Small Key, Long Island, and New Island were recognized, as also Condor, Timor, Aros, and Pisang, Pulotea, Pulotote, and Sumatra, before the arrival at Batavia, which took place upon the 30th of November. We have already had occasion to mention the localities which witnessed the completion of the voyage. It is enough to state that from Batavia, where the crews took the fever, Wallis proceeded by the Cape, thence to St. Helena, and finally arrived in the Downs on the 20th of May, 1768, after 637 days' voyage. It is to be regretted that Hawkesworth has not reproduced the instructions Wallis received from the Admiralty. Without knowing what they were, we cannot decide whether this brave sailor carried out the orders he had received au pied de la lettre. We have seen that he followed with little variation the route traced by his predecessors in the Pacific Ocean. In fact, nearly all had approached by the dangerous archipelago, leaving unexplored that portion of Oceania, where islands are most numerous, and where Cook was later to make such important discoveries. Clever as a navigator, Wallis understood how to obtain from a hasty and incomplete equipment unexpected resources, which enabled him to bring an adventurous enterprise to a successful close. He is equally to be honored for his humanity and the efforts he made to collect reliable information of the countries he visited. Had he only been accompanied by special men of science, there is no doubt that their scientific harvest would have been abundant. The fault lay with the Admiralty. We have related how, on the 10th of April, 1767, as the Dauphin and the Swallow entered the Pacific, the former, carried away by a strong breeze, had lost sight of the latter and had been unable to follow her. This separation was most unfortunate for Captain Carteret. He knew better than any of his crew the dilapidated condition of his vessel and the insufficiency of his provisions. In short, he was well aware that he could only hope to meet the Dauphin in England, as no plan of operation had been arranged, and no rendezvous had been named, a grave omission on Wally's part, who was aware of the condition of his consort. Nevertheless, Carteret allowed none of his apprehensions to come to the knowledge of the crew. At first, the detestable weather experienced by the Swallow upon the Pacific Ocean, most misleading name, allowed no time for reflection. The dangers of the passing moment, in which there was every prospect of their being engulfed, hid from them the perils of the future. Carteret steered for the north, by the coast of Chile. Upon investigating the quantity of soft water which he had on board, he found it quite insufficient for the voyage he had undertaken. He determined, therefore, before setting sail for the west, to take in water at Juan Fernandez or at Massafuero. The weather continued wretched. Upon the evening of the 27th, a sudden squall was followed by a rising wind, which carried the vessel straight to the Cape. The violence of the storm failed to carry away the masts or to founder the ship. The tempest continued in all its fury, and the sails, being extremely wet, clung round the masts and rigging so closely that it was impossible to work them. Next day, a sudden wave broke the mizzenmast, just where there was a flaw in the sail, and submerged the vessels for a few moments. The storm only abated sufficiently to allow the crew of the Swallow time to recover a little and to repair the worst damage, then recommenced and continued with violent squalls until the 7th of May. The wind then became favorable, and 3 days later Juan Fernandez was reached. Carteret was not aware that the Spaniards had fortified this island. He was, therefore, extremely surprised at seeing a large number of men upon the shore, and at perceiving a battery of 4 pieces on the beach, and a fort, pierced with 20 embrasures and surmounted by the Spanish flag, upon a hill. The rising wind prevented an entrance into Cumberland Bay, and after cruising about for an entire day, Carteret was obliged to content himself with reaching Massafuero. But he met the same obstacles, and the surge which broke upon the shore interfered with his operations, and it was only with the utmost difficulty that he succeeded in shipping a few casks of water. Some of the crew, who had been forced by the state of the sea to remain on land, killed guinea fowls enough to feed the entire crew. These, with the exception of some seals and plenty of fish, were the sole result of a stay, marked by a succession of squalls and storms, which constantly placed the ship in danger. Carteret, who, owing to unfavorable winds, had had several opportunities of noticing Massafuro, corrected many of the errors in the account of Lord Anson's voyage, and furnished many details of inestimable use to navigators. On leaving Massafuro, Carteret steered northward in the hope of meeting the southeastern trade wind. Carried farther than he had counted upon, he determined to seek St. Ambrose and St. Felix Island, or the island of St. Paul. Now that the Spaniards had taken possession of and fortified Juan Fernandez, those islands might be of great value to the English in the event of war. But Mr. Green's charts and the elements of navigation by Robertson did not tally as to their situation. Carteret, having most confidence in the latter work, sought for them in the north and failed to find them. In rereading the description given by Wazer, Davis surgeon, he thought these two islands were identical with the land met with by that filibuster in his route to the south of the Galapagos Islands, and that Davis Land did not exist. This caused a double error, that of identifying St. Felix Island with Davis Land, and of denying the existence of the latter, which is in reality Easter Island. At this parallel, says Carteret, that is in 18 degrees west from his point of departure, we had fresh breezes and a strong northerly current, and other reasons for conjecturing that we were near Davis Land, which we were seeking so carefully. But a stiff breeze rising again, we steered quarter SW, and reached 2 degrees southern latitude, from which it follows that if this land, or anything answering to it, exists, I must infallibly have fallen in with it, or at least have seen it. I afterwards remained in 28 degrees south latitude, and degrees west of my point of departure, and as far as I can conjecture 121 degrees west London. All the navigators combined in insisting upon the existence of a southern continent. Carteret could not conceive that Davis Land was but a small island, a spot lost in the immensity of the ocean. As he found no continent, he decided upon the non-existence of Davis Land. It was precisely in this way that he was misled. Carteret continued his search until the 7th of June. He was in 28 degrees south latitude and degrees west longitude, that is to say, he was in the immediate neighborhood of Easter Island. It was still the depth of winter. The sea ran continually high, violent and variable winds. Dull, foggy and cold weather was accompanied by thunder, rain and snow. No doubt it was owing to the great darkness, and to the thick fog which hid the sun for several days that Carteret failed to perceive Easter Island, for many signs, such as the number of birds, floating seaweeds and sea, announced the neighborhood of land. These atmospheric troubles again retarded the voyage, in addition to which the Swallow was as bad a sailor as possible, and one may guess at the weariness, the preoccupation, even the mental suffering of the captain, who saw his crew on the point of starvation. But in spite of all, the voyage was continued by day and night in a westerly direction until the 2nd of July. Upon this day land was discovered to the north, and on the morrow, Carteret was sufficiently close to recognize it. It was only a great rock 5 miles in circumference, covered with trees which appeared uninhabited, but the swell, so prevalent at this time of year, prevented the vessel coming alongside. It was named Pitcairn after the first discoverer. In these latitudes, the sailors, previously in good health, felt the first attacks of scurvy. Upon the 11th, a new land was seen in 22 degrees southern latitude and degrees 34 longitude. It received the name of Osnaburg in honor of the king's second son. Next day, Carteret sent an expedition to 2 more islands, where neither eatables nor water were found. The sailors caught many birds in their hands, as they were so tame that they did not fly at the approach of man. All these islands belonged to the dangerous group, a long chain of low islands, clusters of which were the despair of all navigators, for the few resources they offered. Carteret thought he recognized Quiros in the land discovered, but this place, which is called by the natives Tahiti, is situated more to the north. Sickness, however, increased daily. The adverse winds, but especially the damage the ship had sustained, made her progress very slow. Carteret thought it necessary to follow the route upon which he was most likely to obtain provisions and the needful repairs. My intention in the event of my ship being repaired, says Carteret, was to continue my voyage to the south upon the return of a favorable season, with a view to new discoveries in that quarter of the world. In fact, I had settled in my own mind, if I could find a continent where sufficient provisions were procurable, to remain near its coast until the sun had passed the equator, then to gain a distant southern latitude, and to proceed westward towards the Cape of Good Hope, and to return eastward after touching at the Falkland Islands, should it be necessary, and thence to proceed quickly to Europe. These laudable intentions show Carteret to have been a true explorer, rather stimulated than intimidated by danger, but it proved impossible to carry them into execution. The trade wind was only met on the 16th, and the weather remained detestable. Above all, although Carteret navigated in the neighborhood of Danger Island, discovered in 1765 by Byron, and by others, he saw no land. We probably were close by land, he says, which the fog prevented our seeing, for in these waters numbers of birds constantly flew round the ship. Commodore Byron in his last voyage had passed the northern limits of this portion of the ocean, in which the Solomon Islands are said to be situated, and as I have been myself beyond the southern limit without seeing them, I have good reasons for thinking that if these islands exist, they have been badly marked on all the charts. This last supposition is correct, but the Solomon Islands do exist, and Carteret stopped there a few days later without recognizing them. The victuals were now all but consumed or tainted, the rigging and the sails torn by the tempest, half the crew on the sick list, when a fresh alarm for the captain arose. A leak was reported, just below the low water line. It was impossible to stop it, as long as they were in the open sea. By unexpected good fortune land was seen on the morrow. Needless to say what cries of delight, what acclamations followed this discovery. To use Carteret's own comparison, the feelings of surprise and comfort experienced by the crew can only be likened to those of a criminal, who at the last moment on the scaffold receives a reprieve. It was Nightingale Island, already discovered by Mendana. No sooner was the anchor cast than landing was hurried, in search of water supply. The natives were black, with woolly hair, and perfectly naked. They appeared upon the shore, but fled again before the boat could come up with them. The leader of the landing party described the country as wild, bristling with mountains and impenetrable forests of trees and shrubs reaching to the shore itself, through which ran a fine current of fresh water. The following day, the master was sent in search of an easier landing place, with orders to propitiate the natives, if possible, by presents. He was expressly enjoined not to expose himself to danger, to return if several pirogues advanced against him, not to leave the boat himself, and not to allow more than 2 men to land at once, whilst the remainder held themselves on the defensive. Carteret, at the same time, sent his ship's boat on shore for water. Some natives attacked it with arrows, which fortunately hit no one. Meantime, the sloop regained the Swallow. The master had 3 arrows in his body, and half his crew were so dangerously wounded that 3 sailors and he himself died a few days later. This is what had happened. Landing the 5th in succession, in a spot where he had noticed huts, he entered into friendly traffic with the natives. The latter soon increased in numbers, and several large pirogues advanced towards his sloop, and he was unable to rejoin it until the very moment when the attack commenced. Pursued by the arrows of the natives, who waded up to their shoulders into the water, chased by pirogues, he only succeeded in escaping after having killed several natives and foundered one of their boats. Pursued by the arrows of the natives. Pursued by the arrows of the natives. This effort to find a more favorable spot where he might run the Swallow ashore, having ended so unfortunately, Carteret heaved his ship down where he was, and efforts were made to stop the leak. If the carpenter, the only healthy man on board, did not succeed in perfectly stopping it, he at least considerably diminished it. Whilst a fresh landing for water was sought, the fire of the guns was directed upon the woods, as well as volleys of musketry from the sloop. Still, the sailors worked for a quarter of an hour, when they were attacked by a shower of arrows, which grievously wounded 1 or 2 in the breast. The same measures were necessary each time they fetched water. At this juncture, 30 of the crew became incapable of performing their duty. The master died of his wounds. Lieutenant Gower was very ill. Carteret himself, attacked by a bilious and inflammatory illness, was forced to keep his bed. These 3 were the only officers capable of navigating the Swallow to England, and they were on the point of succumbing.